In 1960, the Soviet Union could put a man in space, but it couldn't keep a quart of milk cold in a kitchen. Why? At the very height of the Cold War, the world lived in a state of permanent, breathless tension. Two superpowers stood on the brink, ready to wipe each other out in minutes. From the outside, the USSR looked unbreakable, an industrial titan that did the impossible. They designed the R-7 Semyorka, the first ICBM capable of crossing the planet faster than a bullet. They put Yuri Gagarin in space, beating the US to the ultimate prize. They could mobilize millions of workers for war faster than the West could plan a holiday. And yet, inside the very homes of the engineers who built those rockets, a different story was unfolding. For millions of Soviet citizens, owning a refrigerator wasn't a basic right. It was considered a small miracle. We aren't talking about modern fridges with ice dispensers. We are talking about a simple, insulated metal box that kept food cold, consistently. This wasn't just a Western joke, it was the reality for Soviet citizens. Look at the numbers. By 1960, America was buying everything in sight. Roughly 90% of American households had an electric refrigerator as the heartbeat of their kitchen. In the Soviet Union, at that same moment, that number was less than 5%. How is that possible? How does a system master the vacuum of space but fail to master the temperature of a kitchen? But first, if you want more stories about how systems actually work, not just the propaganda, hit like and subscribe. Because this contradiction wasn't an accident of history. It wasn't just bad luck or a lack of resources. It was a feature of the system itself. This is the story of how power really works and why the most important battle of the Cold War wasn't fought with nuclear warheads, but with appliances. The cracks in the facade first appeared on a hot afternoon in July 1959. It happened at Sokolniki Park in Moscow during the American National Exhibition, a rare cultural exchange where the United States was allowed to show the Soviet people what life was like in the capitalist West. But the Americans didn't bring tanks. They brought art, fashion, cars, and a model home meant for the average worker. At the center of this house was a kitchen equipped with a built-in dishwasher, a massive refrigerator, and a variety of gadgets that looked like science fiction to the Muscovite crowd. Vice President Richard Nixon and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev began their tour of the house, followed by a mob of reporters and cameras. They weren't in a war room, they were standing in front of a washing machine. Nixon, sensing a political opening, pointed to the appliances and said, "In America, we want to make life easier for our women. We have many different manufacturers so that the consumer has a choice." Khrushchev, a man of peasant origins and immense pride, felt the sting of the comparison. He didn't see progress, he saw capitalist decadence. He snapped back, his voice rising with visible annoyance. "Do you think the Soviet people will be struck dumb by this? You build houses that last 20 years so you can sell new ones. We build for our children and grandchildren. We have these things too, you know." But they didn't, not really. This became known as the kitchen debate. It was the moment the Cold War shifted from the macro to the micro, from nuclear silos to Formica countertops. Khrushchev mocked the triviality of American gadgets, famously asking Nixon if there was a machine that put food in the mouth and pushed it down the throat. He laughed at the wastefulness of having 50 different types of mixers. But behind the laughter, there was a terrifying realization for the Soviet leadership. For the first time, the Soviet people weren't looking at a map of troop movements. They were looking at a lemon-yellow refrigerator and wondering, why don't I have that? The Americans weren't winning the battle of firepower, they were winning the battle of the standard of living. During that same 1959 exhibition, a man named Donald Kendall, an executive at Pepsi Cola, decided to take a massive gamble. He knew that the only way to get Pepsi into the closed Soviet market was to get the leader to like it. He convinced Nixon to lead Khrushchev to the Pepsi soda fountain. In a photograph that would become legendary, Khrushchev is seen cautiously sipping the dark, carbonated, capitalist syrup. To the shock of his handlers, he loved it. He began handing cups to the crowd, shouting, "This is good Pepsi! It is refreshing!" This created a bizarre logistical nightmare for the future. By the 1970s, Pepsi wanted to expand in the USSR, but there was a problem. The Soviet ruble was worthless on the international market. It couldn't be traded for dollars. So how did the Soviet Union pay for its soda? They traded. Initially, they traded Stolichnaya vodka. But as the demand for Pepsi grew, vodka wasn't enough. In 1989, the Soviet government made one of the most lopsided trades in history. They gave Pepsi a fleet of 17 old submarines, a cruiser, a frigate, and a destroyer. For a moment, the Pepsi-Cola company owned the sixth largest navy in the world. Kendall later joked to the U.S. National Security Advisor, "We are disarming the Soviet Union faster than you are." He wasn't wrong. A superpower was trading its navy for sugar water. If you lived in the Soviet Union after the 1959 exhibition, the dream of the refrigerator started to consume the public consciousness. But Soviet production was a world of brutal extremes. There was no choice. There was only what the state decided to build. If you were a member of the nomenklatura, the elite party officials, top scientists, or famous artists, you didn't just get an appliance, you waited years for the tank of the kitchen, the ZIL Moskva. The ZIL wasn't just a fridge, it was a status symbol. It was manufactured in the Zavod imeni Likhachova, the same factory that produced the massive armored limousines used by the General Secretary to drive through Red Square. Because the factory was used to military standards, the ZIL refrigerator was built like a bunker. It used high-grade steel, thick chrome handles, and heavy rubber seals that were actually diverted from military vehicle production. They were so over-engineered that many of them are still humming away in Russian apartments today, nearly 70 years later. They are symbols of a time when the USSR tried to prove it could do luxury. But for the average citizen, the ZIL was a ghost, something you saw in magazines but never in person. For the average worker, there was the Saratov. The Saratov was the reality of Soviet life. It was small, it was deafeningly loud, and it was notorious for its migration. The motor was so poorly balanced that the fridge would literally vibrate its way across the kitchen floor during the night. By the 1970s, the USSR had finally ramped up production to 4 million units a year, but the quality control was a disaster. In the Soviet planned economy, a factory was rewarded for quantity, not quality. If the plan said you must ship 1,000 refrigerators by Friday, you shipped 1,000 refrigerators. It didn't matter if the compressors didn't work. It didn't matter if the doors didn't shut. In some documented batches, 30% of refrigerators arrived at the stores already broken, but the factory manager didn't care. On his paperwork, he was a hero. In the citizen's kitchen, he was a ghost of a failed promise. In the West, if your refrigerator broke, it was an annoyance. You called a repairman or went to Sears to buy a new one on credit. In the Soviet Union, a refrigerator wasn't an appliance, it was a financial asset. Because they were so rare and expensive, often costing several months' salary, people didn't throw them away, ever. Refrigerator units were listed in legal wills. They were passed down from grandmothers to granddaughters like family jewels. If your ZIL or Saratov broke, calling an official state repairman was useless. You might wait 6 months for a visit. Instead, a shadow economy emerged. You would find a master, often an off-duty mechanic who worked on T-54 tanks or MiG engines, and pay him in vodka or Western cigarettes to fix your fridge using smuggled parts or pieces salvaged from crashed military vehicles. This created a population of MacGyvers. Every Soviet citizen knew how to jumpstart a compressor or seal a leak with industrial glue. They had to, because in a system that could launch a man to the moon but couldn't stock a spare part for a kitchen fridge, survival was a DIY project. So why did it happen? Why? Why could they build a rocket that reached the stars but not a motor that didn't vibrate a Saratov off its feet? The answer lies in the nail paradox. In the Soviet Union, planners in Moscow sat in massive offices trying to map the entire economy on spreadsheets. They didn't have prices to tell them what people wanted. They only had quotas. There's a famous Soviet satirical cartoon that perfectly captures this. A factory manager stands proudly next to a crane holding a 1-ton nail. Why? Because the central planners measured the factory's success by the total weight of nails produced. So instead of making thousands of useful small nails, the factory made one giant useless nail to hit their weight target instantly. If the planners changed the metric to quantity, the factory would respond by making millions of tiny needle-sized nails that were too small to hold wood together. This is the feedback vacuum. In a market economy, if you make a refrigerator that explodes or a nail that doesn't work, you go bankrupt. The market is a giant sensor that tells you when you are failing. But the Soviet system was flying blind. It was a massive machine with no nerves. For a factory manager, innovation was a threat. If you tried to improve the Saratov's motor, you had to stop the assembly line to retool the machines. If you stopped the line, you missed your quota for the month. If you missed your quota, the ministry didn't care about your innovation, they saw sabotage. So managers did the only logical thing. They produced the exact same flawed, loud, inefficient design for 30 straight years. They optimized for the report, not the result. The illusion of Soviet parity finally shattered, not in a laboratory, but in a grocery store in Houston, Texas in 1989. Boris Yeltsin, a rising Soviet official, was visiting the Johnson Space Center. On the way back, he asked to make an unscheduled stop at a regular supermarket called Randall's. He walked through the aisles in a trance. He saw 20 types of cheese. He saw fresh pineapples in the middle of winter. He saw aisles of frozen puddings. Yeltsin was so stunned he asked his aides if this was a Potemkin store, a fake shop set up by the CIA to trick him. He walked up to an ordinary shopper and asked how much they earned and if they could really afford all this. When he realized this was just an ordinary store for ordinary people, he was devastated. He told his entourage, "If our people who wait in line for hours for a loaf of bread saw this, there would be a revolution." He later wrote in his autobiography that at that moment, standing among the frozen foods, he knew the Soviet system was finished. The missiles didn't matter anymore. The refrigerators had won. We didn't win because of lasers. We won because we could admit when we were wrong. The Soviet Union didn't fall on a battlefield. It died in a grocery store aisle. It prioritized the things that could be counted by a satellite, tanks and rockets, while ignoring the quiet, essential infrastructure of the human kitchen. You can fake strength for decades. You can launch satellites and intimidate nations, but you cannot fake everyday life forever. The Soviet Union didn't fall because of missiles. It fell because it ignored the people living there. We focus on the battles, but the Cold War wasn't just won with tanks. It was won in the kitchen. Thank you for watching this deep dive into the hidden history of the Cold War. If you found this perspective valuable, don't forget to hit the like button and share your thoughts in the comments. Do you think our modern systems have lost their feedback loops? Stay with us, because the most important lessons of history aren't found on the battlefield. They are lived at home.